As Rome's vaunted legions were fighting Hannibal at the conclusion of the 3rd century BC, another ancient civilization far to the east was entering its first true golden age. The dynasty of Qin Shi Huangdi had collapsed soon after his death, but this first Chinese emperor paved the way for a Han dynasty to rise in its place. Reigning for 400 years, the Han presided over an empire whose territorial extent, cultural brilliance, and scientific advancement equaled or surpassed that of the Romans. Like their far western counterparts, this Chinese civilization also needed protection from a multitude of threats, so Han China developed one of the most technologically sophisticated militaries in the ancient world. Welcome to our video on the armies of China's Han dynasty, how they fought, and their progression throughout the era. This episode is brought to you by Ground News. Judge the truth for yourself. Ground News is an app run by a small team of 7 Canadian industry outsiders with the mission of empowering the average newsreader to fight against the rise of misinformation, sensationalism, and biased news. They enable you to easily compare how sources from the left, center, and right are reporting on a story, empowering you to see exactly how the story is being spun to fit a political narrative. Then you can go deeper and see if the story is receiving balanced coverage, or if it's only being covered by media on the left or the right. Get the tools you need to quickly analyze the news and judge the truth for yourself. Ground News is a free app now available on the App Store, Google Play Store, and your desktop web browser. Just click the link in the description below. The tumultuous centuries prior to Qin Shi Huangdi's unification of China played host to devastating bouts of violence, the likes of which had never been seen before. Known as the Warring States period, it heralded warfare's increasing scale, in addition to organizational, tactical, and technological progress. This legacy, which included Sun Tzu's famous work The Art of War, would serve as a foundation for the Han imperial military. Aiming to change the fragmented political organization and identity of China during the Warring States period, the Han emperors and their centralized bureaucracy immediately began propagating an ideology of loyalty to one all-powerful divine monarch, and a common sense of being Chinese rather than an inhabitant of the Chu, Wei, or Qi kingdoms. Though the Dragon Throne was Imperial China's ultimate authority, any ruler requires subordinates to execute their will, military leaders among them. Contrary to similar figures in other civilizations, Han field commanders, known as Zhengjun, were appointed and dictated by traditions uniquely Eastern in nature. A method to prevent military coups or insurrections against central authority was to have single armies led by 2 generals rather than just one, the general of the left and general of the right. If one of the 2 commanders sought to turn his army around and lead it against his sovereign, the logic was that, hopefully, his rival general would remain loyal and foil the scheme. Also, with treachery in mind, Han military appointments were not permanent. Generals were sent on an ad hoc basis to lead a specific army for a specific purpose, and given an official title which designated that purpose. For example, the general of an expedition to Korea was dubbed General Charged with Crossing the Liao. Such Zhengjun were most often selected from among court officials who were familiar with, and therefore directly answerable to, the emperor. At surface level, such a system might seem non-meritocratic and counterproductive, however this was in fact far from the case. In Chinese military custom, generals were subject to outright execution if they were defeated in battle or failed to accomplish their given mission. This way of doing things, sometimes regarded with horror by Western observers, was justified by a mixture of Middle Kingdom politics and Taoist philosophy. High army officials were expected to be supreme paragons of virtue, completely in tune with the Tao or flow of the universe. Therefore, misfortune or defeat by bad luck could never befall such an exemplary figure. This meant that if they were defeated, it could only have been their fault for deviating from the right path. Consequently, the general could be held accountable by execution. This high-minded justification may often have been a pretense for getting rid of a political rival. Knowing this potential fate, and realizing that they could be called upon to command an army at any time if the sovereign decreed it, imperial courtiers voraciously devoured China's classic military texts in hopes of increasing their prowess in tactics, strategy and command. This savage incentive therefore gave Han emperors a steady pool of studied men to select from if there was a need for imperial armies to march. Management of the Han military as a whole during the Western period fell to the Grand Commandant, who took care of broader-scale administration and empire-wide appointments. He was one of the emperor's three excellencies, a triad of chief ministers who were almost always at their monarch's side. However, a further glimpse of paranoia about the prospect of usurpers can be seen in that the Grand Commandant was not in control of the Palace Guard, a part of China's armed forces which was completely separate. As the Han dynasty began to lose its central authority, however, the post of Grand Commandant was abolished. In its place, effective control over the troops of each commandery was handled by the respective regional commandant, who was usually an experienced military veteran. The vast manpower at the disposal of a Western Han general was drawn from three primary sources: conscripts, volunteers, and convicts. Throughout the 4-century-long dynasty, this system did not remain static, instead changing to meet the empire's needs at varying times. Taking inspiration from their Qin predecessors and the later warring states' kingdoms before that, early Han armies were made up mainly of a mass of conscript peasant infantry. In standard circumstances, these levies would be between 23 and 56 years of age, but this scope could be widened in emergency situations. After their forced recruitment, Chinese conscripts spent their first year of service in training and drill, followed by another year at the capital, in one of the empire's commandery armies, or in a frontier garrison. After the completion of mandatory service in the Son of Heaven's army, former soldiers returned home and frequently served as part of their local militia or Panming, a reserve force which could be called up when necessary. Contrary to the bulk of infantry conscripts, the Han cavalry forces were generally considered elite by comparison. Imperial Horsemen usually originated from high-born clans from across China and could afford to maintain horses and the proper equipment of a cavalryman, which will be discussed later. In addition to these native horsemen, mounted units were also raised from the Han Empire's dependent dominions, or shukuo, a trend which increased exponentially in frequency after the nomadic Xiongnu's defeat at Chinese hands during the mid-2nd century BC. Employing Barbarian Horsemen was a logical and sound choice for the Han dynasty, as their riders' experience and equipment was already suited for warfare on the northwestern steppe frontier. One of these foreign auxiliaries, the Proto-Mongolic Wuhuan people, were widely regarded as being lethal in battle, and consequently saw action throughout China from the 1st century onwards. A similar policy of geographical deployment was employed in the tropical south, where troops raised in northern and central China would suffer terrible attrition due to the hostile climate. Therefore, local troops were raised for military duties there instead. Warring states' kingdoms had used convicts in a similar manner to Soviet use of Strafbat, or Wehrmacht employed Strafbattalion penal units in World War II. Such unfortunate malcontents were given the most hazardous tasks and suffered grievous casualties as a consequence, sometimes even forming what Chinese military expert Chris Pears calls fanatical assault forces. By Han times, however, this brutal approach fell out of favour. Most of an army's criminal element was instead used as force labour corps, which would dig trenches, construct fortifications, and perform other manual activities which did not involve fighting. In especially dire situations, generals would arm their convicts for war, usually with promises of freedom. Each clad in a red robe, restrained by an iron neck collar, and possessing a shaved head as a symbolic alternative to decapitation, large quantities of such criminals on the march would appear almost identical to one another. In organization, the smallest unit within imperial armies was the sui, or section, composed of 1 officer and 4 soldiers. Several sui made up a ho, or platoon, and 5 Hou made up a Houquan, a company. This structure was universal at lower levels of command, but the higher echelons differed based upon what kind of army it was. Provincial or frontier garrisons had a sector headquarters or Tuefu, which served as the next rung on the military ladder, while Houquan of field armies would be organized into Ying, the Han equivalent of a division. It was this formation which was under the ultimate control of a Jiangjun and his temporarily appointed Xiaowei or colonels. For protection, Han Chinese infantry were usually clad in lamellar armor made of either leather or iron. This kind of equipment was made up of many small platelets of material which, when bound together, formed a patchwork sheet which went over the body. On their heads, soldiers would wear caps or iron helmets. Bows, swords, spears and halberds were used as weapons, often in combination with shields. But undoubtedly, the most notorious and iconic armament of the Han dynasty was the crossbow. In contrast to traditional bows, which required specialized skills to use effectively, crossbows could be given to a conscript with little training and massed to devastating effect. These ranged weapons were manufactured in various sizes, from light crossbows which could be utilized by mounted troops, to heavy mounted artillery pieces similar to ballistae. However, the largest Chinese crossbows required a pull of over 350 pounds to lock their firing mechanism in place. Strong men capable of doing this were known as chuechang and were considered to be important specialists. Akin to their dismounted counterparts, cavalry also used a variety of weapons, but perhaps the most commonly portrayed troop type during the dynasty was horse archers. Although shown prominently in many pieces of Han art, it is nevertheless difficult to tell whether the depicted warrior is a Chinese horseman trained in mounted bowmanship or a nomadic auxiliary. Some riders would wear armor for protection, similar to their counterparts on foot, but armored horses were not present until the dynasty's twilight days. Shields were used at times, but were rare because the majority of cavalry-specific weapons required 2 hands to use. When the Han dynasty started fraying at the end of the 2nd century of our era, its misfortunes initiated the famous Three Kingdoms period, widely regarded as one of the greatest ages of Chinese warfare. Similar to the developments in the Roman Empire during the same period, armoured shock cavalry seems to have been emphasised more after 200 than in previous eras. Utilised weapons were still primarily lances and bows, but horse archery was no longer only utilised by nomadic auxiliaries. The Civil War era kingdom of Shu Han possessed a so-called flying army composed wholly of native mounted bowmen, implying that steppe practices of warfare were filtering into China. Moreover, the King of Wu in 258 is said to have carried a bow on horseback during warfare. This era of constant warfare gave rise to unorthodox and desperate military tactics shown clearly in the Dare to Die shock troops. Reviving ancient traditions, men in these units would discard long weapons such as spears and instead arm themselves with swords and shields before charging at the enemy and engaging them at close range. During a battle between the Wei and Wu kingdoms in 253, the Wu general even ordered his suicide unit to remove their armor and storm a position atop a dam, almost definitely because it would only hinder them in climbing the slope. Wei defenders laughed when they saw their enemy doing this, but were chastened when the fanatical Wu swordsmen routed them soon after. Much like during the Han period, however, the greatest number of foot soldiers were still either archers or crossbowmen. During the Three Kingdoms, it seems as though the use of ranged contingents became more sophisticated, and they were commonly applied in support of melee infantry as a combined arms force. As armor, weaponry, unit composition and deployment changed in the foreground, the philosophy of warfare also shifted in the background, as Qin progressed to Han and then Han disintegrated into the Three Kingdoms. During the Warring States period, for example, there seems to have been an almost Homeric ethos of combat, but this was merged with a typically Sun Tzu-like intelligence which progressed into the Han dynasty. During the Wu Revolt of 154 BC, for example, Quan Fu's father was slain by the rebels. For the purpose of avenging his death, Quan Fu stormed a Wu camp with only a dozen mounted followers and was immediately outnumbered and overwhelmed. Nevertheless, he is said to have slain up to 30 Wu soldiers and returned from his endeavour alive but covered with wounds. Word of his brave exploits and filial piety spread throughout the empire, and he was made a general by the emperor. Alongside this heroism, there existed a bureaucratic philosophy of conducting campaigns, which was suited to maintaining a large empire. During the Western Han period, a text known as the Three Strategies of Huang Shikeng states that the basis of complete victory is military administration. Another Han general, Huo Chuping, was notorious in his age for absolute contempt for ancient texts such as Sun Tzu. Once again, thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform, and it enables the reader to easily compare how sources from the left, center, and right are reporting on a story, empowering you to see exactly how the story is being spun to fit a political narrative. Get the tools you need to quickly analyze the news and judge the truth for yourself. Ground News is a free app now available on the Apple App Store, Google Play Store, and your desktop web browser. Just click the link in the description below. We have more videos on Chinese history on the way, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.